7 years away changes how you see home. Overseas contracts, temporary housing, airports that blurred together. And through it all, one constant thought kept me grounded, coming back. I was still smiling when I turned onto my street, already picturing quiet evenings and unfinished plans when I slammed the brakes so hard the seatbelt dug into my shoulder. Where my land used to be, there was a gated luxury parking lot. Steel fencing rose out of fresh concrete. Security cameras followed every movement. A polished sign read WILLOW CREEK HOA, premium, parking, and beneath it a pricing board listed monthly rates like this was a 5-star service. Teslas, Range Rovers, and German sedans sat in neat rows, perfectly aligned on my dirt, my future, paved over and monetized. Confusion hit first, then dread, then something heavier. An HOA office trailer stood nearby, like a command post. Inside, Lauren Whitmore leaned back in her chair, calm and unbothered. I placed my deed on her desk. She didn't even look at it. She smiled and said the land had been reclassified while I was gone. Community use, board decision, done deal. When I protested, she waved me off and told me to talk to their lawyers. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't bureaucracy gone wrong. It was theft planned, approved, and protected. And they had no idea what was about to happen next. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to HOA and Karen's Stories and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? I bought that land 12 years earlier, back when the neighborhood was still half dirt roads and optimism. It wasn't an impulse purchase or a gamble. I did it the slow, boring, responsible way. Clean title search, recorded deed, property taxes paid every single year without fail. I remember standing there the first time with a folded survey map in my hands, imagining what it could become. Not a house, not something flashy. A workshop, a place where my sons could learn how to build things with their hands. Where weekends smelled like sawdust and oil instead of screens and noise. It was never just land to me. It was a plan. Life didn't follow the timeline I imagined. Work came first, like it often does. A series of overseas contracts turned into a career I couldn't easily walk away from. Each job paid better than the last, and each one came with the same promise. Just one more year, then I'd come home for good. 7 years passed that way. I missed birthdays. I missed school projects. I missed watching my boys grow into young men. But I paid for everything. The mortgage on the house, the taxes on the land, HOA dues on the main property. I never disappeared. I just wasn't physically there. The HOA, though, operated on proximity. Willow Creek HOA was structured like most others. President, vice president, a handful of board members, committees that changed names every year but always seemed to include the same people. At the center of it all was Lauren Whitmore. She didn't look like a tyrant. She looked polished, professional, the kind of woman who spoke softly and made people lean in. She had a way of turning procedure into power. Rules weren't just guidelines to her, they were tools. While I was gone, Lauren's influence grew. She chaired meetings, guided votes, streamlined decisions. She knew the bylaws better than anyone and made sure everyone else felt unsure of them. When people questioned her, she didn't argue. She referenced sections, clauses, past precedents, authority wrapped in paperwork. My land became a topic during one of those meetings, not loudly, not controversially, quietly. Labeled as unused, then neglected, eventually abandoned. No letters were sent to me, no certified notices. No attempts to verify ownership beyond a surface-level assumption that absence meant forfeiture. A board vote was scheduled with minimal notice, buried between landscaping budgets and pool maintenance. Lauren presented the idea as a solution, not a seizure. Parking congestion had become an issue, she said. Residents were frustrated. Emergency access was a concern. The land could serve the community. The vote passed. Construction followed quickly. too quickly for something that was supposedly benign. A contractor with prior HOA ties was brought in. Permits were fast-tracked. Fencing went up. Asphalt replaced dirt. Security systems were installed. All of it justified as a temporary community improvement, even as long-term infrastructure was poured into the ground. Monthly parking fees were introduced, framed as a way to offset HOA costs. Residents were told the money would help everyone. No one questioned who actually owned the land. By the time the first luxury cars rolled in, the narrative was already set. The HOA wasn't taking something, it was providing something. A benefit. A service. Anyone who objected would be opposing the community itself. Lauren oversaw it all with calm precision. She didn't celebrate. She didn't boast. She simply moved forward, meeting to meeting, decision to decision, creating a reality where my ownership no longer mattered. Paper replaced presence. Votes replaced deeds. And because I wasn't there to object in real time, the story hardened without resistance. What struck me later wasn't just that they took the land, it was how easily they justified it to themselves. No emergency, no crisis. Just opportunity and confidence. They assumed I wouldn't come back, or if I did, I wouldn't fight. They assumed the system they built around the theft would be stronger than the truth underneath it. That was the first betrayal. Not the asphalt, not the fence, but the quiet agreement, made in a room I wasn't invited to, that my absence gave them the right to erase me. I tried to handle it the reasonable way first. I made copies of my deed, tax records, and the original survey, neatly organized in a folder like facts alone should be enough. I requested a meeting, not to argue, but to clarify what had to be an error. I walked into the HOA office, calm, controlled, and respectful, believing that once ownership was put in front of them, the situation would correct itself. It didn't. Lauren barely glanced at the documents. She thanked me for bringing my concerns forward and told me the board would need time to review everything. Days turned into weeks. Emails went unanswered or came back with carefully worded delays. Under review. Pending legal consultation. We'll circle back. Every response felt rehearsed, designed to exhaust rather than resolve. When I pressed again, the tone shifted. A notice appeared taped to the temporary fence on my land, printed on official-looking letterhead. Trespassing, prohibited. My name was listed as the offender. According to the HOA, I was no longer authorized to access the property. I stood there reading it twice, trying to process the absurdity of being warned off land I had owned for over a decade. That confusion quickly turned into anger when a second notice arrived at my house, this one more formal, referencing HOA bylaws and community safety. Then came the letters. Thick envelopes, legal language. Paragraphs filled with references to sections, subsections, and consequences. They warned me against interference, against harassment, against disruptive behavior. One letter suggested fines. Another hinted at further action if I continued unauthorized contact regarding the parking operation. None of them outright said I didn't own the land. They didn't have to. They wrote as if that question had already been settled. The HOA meeting was worse. I attended expecting a discussion. What I walked into felt more like a trial. Lauren controlled the room effortlessly. Before I could speak, she framed the issue for everyone. She described a returning individual, attempting to interfere with a community improvement. She spoke about safety concerns, legal compliance, and the need to protect residents from disruption. By the time I was allowed to speak, eyes were already on me, not with curiosity, but suspicion. When I explained that the land was mine, that I had documentation, that I was never notified, the reaction was cold. Lauren responded with practiced patience, suggesting that ownership disputes were complex and best handled by attorneys, not emotional confrontations. A few board members nodded. Someone whispered. Another resident muttered that the parking lot had been a blessing. I felt the room turn, slowly but decisively. After that meeting, the neighborhood changed. People who used to wave stopped making eye contact. Conversations cut short when I walked by. I overheard fragments, words like selfish, greedy, trying to take away parking. The HOA's version of events had spread quickly and cleanly. In it, I wasn't the owner. I was the problem. The parking fees went up shortly after. What had been presented as a modest community solution suddenly became a premium service. New signage appeared with updated rates, reserved spots, late fees, towing warnings. The lot was no longer about easing congestion, it was about revenue. Luxury vehicles cycled through faster. Temporary permits became permanent. The operation expanded without hesitation, as if the HOA felt untouchable. That confidence showed everywhere. Security patrols increased, though no uniforms were ever consistent. Different men, different vehicles, all claiming to represent the HOA. They lingered when I drove by, watched when I stopped near the fence, made casual comments meant to feel like warnings. You should really let the lawyers handle this. Wouldn't want things to get complicated. Nothing overt, nothing I could easily report. Just pressure. I realized then that this wasn't improvisation. This was structure. Every move I made was met with a response that suggested preparation. They weren't afraid of my documents. They weren't worried about my protests. They believed they were protected by lawyers, by procedure, by the simple fact that they had been in control long enough for control to feel permanent. I stopped trying to convince them. For the first time since I returned, I understood the scale of what I was facing. This wasn't a misunderstanding between neighbors. It wasn't even an overreaching HOA decision that could be reversed with a vote. This was an organization that had rewritten reality around my absence and fortified it with money, fear, and public perception. And as much as it angered me, that realization brought clarity. They weren't reacting because they had done nothing wrong. They were confident because they believed no one could touch them. That was when I knew calm explanations were over. And observation had to begin. I didn't announce what I was doing next. I didn't threaten. I didn't send another email that would be ignored or twisted into harassment. I stopped feeding the machine that ran on my reactions. Instead, I backed away just enough to see it clearly. If Lauren and the board were so confident, it meant they believed the paperwork protected them. So I decided to read their paperwork the way they did, line by line, date by date, signature by signature, until the story they'd built started to contradict itself. I started with what was supposed to be public: HOA meeting minutes, budgets, annual reports, anything that touched finances or community improvements. Most associations hide behind vague language, but Willow Creek liked to document everything in a way that looked official. It wasn't hard to request copies. They couldn't refuse without admitting they had something to conceal, so they sent me packets, scanned PDFs, meeting summaries, newsletters that celebrated the parking lot as a residential benefit. At first glance, it looked clean. Too clean. I printed the minutes and spread them across my dining table. I highlighted names. I wrote timelines in the margins. I compared the vote that reclassified my land to every prior meeting that mentioned it. That's when the first fracture appeared. The dates didn't line up. One set of minutes claimed the board voted in mid-April. Another document referenced the decision as having occurred in March. A newsletter bragged that construction began immediately after the February approval, 3 different months for the same event. I told myself it could be sloppy record-keeping until I noticed the signatures. The same board member's name appeared in multiple places, but the handwriting changed. On one page it was sharp and slanted. On another it was rounded and almost childish. The president's signature looked identical every time, like a stamp. The secretary's initials were missing in spots where they were required. It didn't feel like one set of people sitting in meetings and documenting reality. It felt like someone constructing a paper trail after the fact. I moved beyond the HOA's documents and into the part they couldn't control. County records. Property ownership was simple, my deed was recorded, my taxes were current, and there had never been a transfer. That part wasn't in dispute if you knew where to look, but permits and approvals, that was where Lauren had always implied legitimacy. So I started checking those. The HOA provided permit numbers in their improvement packet as if that ended the discussion. I called the county planning office and asked a clerk to confirm them. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear typing, then silence, then typing again. "We don't have those in our system," she said finally. I tried another number. Same result. I read it again, thinking maybe I'd mispronounced a digit. No. The clerk asked me to repeat it twice, then told me something that made my stomach tighten. "That format isn't even how our permit numbers are issued." I hung up and drove to the county building in person. I waited in line, filled out request forms, paid a small fee for printed records. It took hours, but I walked out with something priceless, proof that the official permits the HOA referenced didn't exist. That alone would have been enough to show misconduct. But the deeper I looked, the uglier it got. A gated parking lot isn't just asphalt. It needs power for the gate mechanism, lighting, cameras, charging stations. It needs wiring, conduit, sometimes water for maintenance. I walked the perimeter of the lot at dusk, keeping my distance, acting like a curious resident instead of an angry owner. I watched where the lights were fed from. I followed cable runs with my eyes until I saw a utility box mounted near the fence line. It wasn't new. It wasn't marked properly. And it sure as hell wasn't placed according to code. I called the utility company and asked if there was an active service account tied to that installation. The representative couldn't give me details, but she confirmed enough to raise alarms. The service was registered under an HOA maintenance account that didn't match the address on the utility box. In other words, the lot was drawing power through a setup that didn't belong there. Illegal hookups weren't just violations, they were liabilities. The kind that made insurance companies run, the kind that made county inspectors start using words like hazard and immediate compliance. I needed one more thing though, something that didn't come from my suspicions or my observations. Something that tied Lauren's hands in a way she couldn't talk her way out of. That came from a neighbor I barely knew. Her name was Mrs. Harlan, an older woman who lived 2 doors down from the trailer office. Quiet, the kind of person who tended her garden in the morning and kept her blinds half closed at night. She'd nodded politely in passing, but never joined the neighborhood chatter. One afternoon, as I stood by my mailbox sorting through yet another HOA letter, she walked over slowly and asked, almost casually, "Are you the man who owns that lot?" When I said yes, she didn't look surprised. She looked tired. "I used to work at the county clerk's office," she said. "Retired now, but I know how these things are supposed to look." She didn't offer opinions. She offered facts. She told me the HOA had come to the county building months earlier, not to file permits, but to ask questions. How long a property owner had to be unreachable before something could be claimed as abandoned, what kind of notices were required, what could be posted publicly versus served privately. She remembered it because Lauren had come in person, confident and smiling, and because the clerk on duty had explained, very clearly, that you can't quietly take private property without due process. Mrs. Isbera. Harlan lowered her voice and added one last detail. They were told they'd need certified notices. Multiple. And they never filed proof of service. Not once. That was it. The missing link. Not just that the HOA didn't notify me, but that they knew they were required to, and moved forward anyway. I walked back inside my house and laid everything out. The inconsistent minutes, the mismatched signatures, the fake permit numbers, utility discrepancies, and Mrs. Harlan's confirmation that the HOA had been warned. For the first time since I returned, the fog lifted completely. This wasn't a gray area. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a scheme built on fraud, protected by intimidation and disguised as community improvement. And now I finally had proof that could break it. I didn't confront anyone with what I'd found. I didn't hint. I didn't let it slip in conversation or posture at the next HOA meeting. I did the opposite of what they expected. I went quiet. Completely. The first call I made was to a property attorney recommended by someone who didn't live anywhere near Willow Creek. I wanted distance. I wanted neutrality. I wanted someone who wouldn't be intimidated by HOA letterhead or impressed by confident board members. When we met, I laid everything out in chronological order and then stopped talking. He read without interrupting, page after page, occasionally making a note in the margin. When he finished, he closed the folder and said one sentence that changed the tone of everything. They didn't just overstep. They exposed themselves. We agreed on a simple rule: no contact, no responses to HOA emails, no statements, no warnings. Every move from that point forward would be deliberate and documented. If Lauren wanted noise, she wouldn't get it from me. The second professional came in quietly, a forensic accountant. Not someone who advertised, not someone who rushed, someone methodical. His job wasn't to argue legality. It was to follow money. HOAs love complexity, multiple accounts, operating funds, reserve funds, special assessments, temporary project buckets. It creates confusion, and confusion hides intent, but it also leaves trails. Every parking fee collected, every contractor payment, every reimbursement. He pulled bank records, monthly summaries, internal financial reports that the HOA assumed no one outside the board would ever truly examine. The results weren't subtle. The parking operation wasn't breaking even. It wasn't even close. It was generating thousands every month, steady, predictable income on land the HOA didn't own. Fees had been raised twice in under a year, not because of costs, but because demand allowed it. Late penalties, towing arrangements, premium spot upgrades. It was structured like a business, not a community solution. Then the personal benefits emerged. Board members weren't just overseeing the operation. Some were directly connected to it. Discounted parking for relatives, consulting reimbursements that lined up perfectly with revenue spikes, maintenance contracts awarded to companies tied to board members through shell ownership or family names. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed corruption at first glance, but enough, when layered together, to show a pattern. Lauren's name appeared often, not in payments directly to her, but in approvals, authorizations, and emergency spending decisions that bypassed standard voting procedures. She signed off on changes that increased revenue without corresponding expenses. She justified them as temporary measures. Temporary had become permanent very quickly. The accountant summarized it plainly: this isn't an HOA mistake. It's an income stream. While all of this was happening, the HOA grew restless. My silence unsettled them more than my objections ever had. Emails increased in frequency and intensity. The tone sharpened. Where before they'd asked me to coordinate through counsel, now they warned me against interfering with ongoing operations. One message accused me of spreading misinformation. Another referenced potential defamation. They wanted a reaction. They needed me emotional, reckless, on record. I gave them nothing. Lauren called emergency meetings. Residents noticed. Notices went out late at night for gatherings scheduled with minimal warning. The agenda items were vague legal updates, risk mitigation, member conduct. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. The pattern was enough. That panic seeped outward. Security presence increased again. Different faces. More lingering. More casual threats wrapped in friendly language. Someone left a note on my door advising me to protect myself legally. Another warned me that court battles were expensive and stressful, especially for someone returning after being gone so long. They were fishing for fear. I documented everything: dates, times, names, photos when possible, screenshots of emails before they could be revised or retracted. My attorney advised patience. "Let them escalate," he said. "Every unnecessary move helps us." The accountant finished his report 2 weeks later. It was devastating. Clean charts, clear timelines, profit margins that erased any claim of community necessity. It didn't accuse, it demonstrated. That was the first countermove, not a lawsuit, not a demand letter, a preparation. We sent preservation notices, formal requests, that the HOA retain all financial records, communications, and surveillance footage related to the parking lot. No accusations, no threats, just a legal obligation they couldn't ignore without consequences. The response was immediate. Lauren's next email arrived less than an hour later. Short, tight. "Please direct all future correspondence through our legal counsel." That was the confirmation I needed. They knew now. Not everything, but enough to understand the ground under them was shifting. Their confidence hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer bold. It was defensive. The stakes rose quietly after that. Once lawyers entered the picture, every step mattered. Every delay carried risk. Every false statement became discoverable. This was no longer about whether they could scare me into backing down. It was about how much damage would surface once the truth was forced into daylight. I stayed silent. I kept collecting. And I waited for the moment when preparation would turn into action, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because the system they trusted had finally given me the leverage to use it against them. The meeting notice went out on a Friday evening, marked "Emergency Session" in bold letters. By Monday night, the community room was full. Every folding chair was taken. People stood along the walls, arms crossed, voices low but restless. This wasn't about landscaping or pool hours. Everyone could feel it. I arrived early and sat near the back. No folder, no documents in my hands. Just a notebook and a pen. I wanted to listen before I spoke. Lauren stood at the front with the board, posture rigid, smile tight. She opened the meeting by thanking everyone for coming and immediately framed the issue as a threat to the HOA. Legal exposure, disruptive behavior, outside interference. She never said my name at first, but every sentence pointed in my direction. When public comment opened, she looked surprised that I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I thanked the board for finally holding an open meeting and said I wanted clarity, not conflict. I reminded the room calmly that I owned the land beneath the parking lot, that I had never been notified of any vote, and that I had spent weeks reviewing records to understand how this happened. Then I paused. "I've also learned," I said evenly, "that not everything presented as approved actually was." The room shifted. I didn't show evidence. I didn't name specifics. I didn't have to. I mentioned permits that didn't exist, utility connections that didn't match public records, financial reports that raised questions about personal benefit. I spoke like someone stating observations, not accusations. Lauren reacted instantly. She cut me off, voice sharp, telling me I was spreading misinformation. She accused me of intimidation, of attempting to destabilize the community. She warned residents that false claims could lead to lawsuits and increased dues. The more she spoke, the faster her words came. Her composure cracked just enough for people to notice. When someone asked why no certified notices were ever sent to the landowner, Lauren snapped that the board had acted within reason and that legal counsel had approved their actions. Another resident asked why parking fees had gone up twice if the lot was just a temporary solution. Lauren dismissed it as market adjustment. The calm in the room evaporated. Board members began speaking over one another. One tried to redirect. Another asked for a recess. Lauren refused. She doubled down, warning that anyone interfering with HOA operations could face liens, fines, even legal action. She looked directly at me when she said it. I nodded once and sat back down. That was when the first reporter raised a hand. She introduced herself as a local housing correspondent, said she'd received tips about a property dispute involving HOA misuse of authority. She asked simple questions. Who owned the land? Were there permits? Why were parking revenues not disclosed in the annual budget? Lauren froze. The meeting ended abruptly after that. No vote, no resolution, just tension thick enough to follow everyone out the door. The next morning, my attorney called. "They're rattled," he said, "and they made a mistake last night. By the end of the week, subpoenas were issued. Not to me, but to the HOA. Financial records, emails, meeting communications, surveillance footage, contractor agreements, everything connected to the parking lot project. Preservation requests turned into legal demands." Suddenly, the casual confidence the board had relied on was gone, replaced by deadlines and obligations they couldn't talk their way around. Lauren's emails stopped entirely. Instead, formal letters arrived from HOA counsel, aggressive in tone, warning of countersuits and liens if I continued to defame the association. My attorney responded once, briefly, attaching copies of the subpoenas. After that, silence again. Media interest grew quietly. A short article appeared online, then another. Nothing sensational, just facts, timelines, unanswered questions, enough to make people read twice. Neighbors who had avoided me before started asking questions. Some apologized without fully understanding why. Others admitted they'd felt uneasy about how fast the project had moved, but assumed someone else had checked the details. I didn't celebrate. I didn't relax, because nothing had been decided yet. Court dates were scheduled, motions filed. Lawyers sharpened arguments. The HOA still believed it could bury this in procedure, outlast me with resources, exhaust me with pressure. And standing in that space, between exposure and judgment, I understood something clearly. This was the most dangerous moment. Not when they felt powerful, not when they felt untouchable, but now, when the truth was close enough to see and the outcome was still uncertain. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. No shouting, no drama, just polished wood, muted voices, and the low hum of air conditioning. Lauren sat at the defense table with her attorneys, posture straight, expression carefully neutral. She looked smaller there, stripped of the HOA podium and the authority that came with it. The judge entered, and everything began. My attorney opened simply, no theatrics. He introduced the land, the deed, and the timeline. The original purchase documents were entered into the record-clean title, recorded properly, never transferred. Tax statements followed year after year, paid without interruption. The judge flipped through them slowly, asked a few clarifying questions, then nodded once. Ownership, at least, was not in dispute anymore. Then came the permits. The HOA's counsel tried to frame the parking lot as a temporary community improvement authorized under board discretion. My attorney asked for the permit numbers referenced in HOA records. They were read aloud. The county clerk testified next. Calm, professional. She confirmed what I already knew. Those permits did not exist. The numbers were invalid. The formats were wrong. No approvals had ever been issued for construction, electrical work, or commercial use on that parcel. Lauren shifted in her chair for the first time. Utility records came next. A representative testified that power had been drawn through an account not legally tied to the property, installed without proper inspection. The judge's expression hardened. Notes were taken. A few words were underlined. Then the financial records were introduced. The forensic accountant explained the parking operation like a business, not a mistake. Monthly income, fee increases, late penalties, net profit. Charts showed steady revenue flowing into HOA accounts, then branching outward. Reimbursements, vendor payments, consulting fees, connections to board members. The room felt heavier with every page. This wasn't an HOA covering costs. This was monetization. When it was Lauren's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with confidence that didn't quite fit the room anymore. She spoke smoothly at first, repeating familiar phrases: community benefit, safety concerns, board authority. But under cross-examination, the rhythm broke. She was asked why no certified notices were sent to the landowner. She said they believed he was unreachable. She was then shown records proving the HOA had inquired about notification requirements and been told exactly what was needed. She hesitated, corrected herself, claimed misunderstanding. She was asked about the abandoned land designation. She said the board voted based on visible neglect. She was shown tax records proving continuous payment and maintenance responsibility. Silence stretched longer than it should have. Then came the signatures. The same board member's name appeared on multiple documents with visibly different handwriting. Lauren said she couldn't explain that. The judge leaned forward slightly. Finally, she was asked whether any board member benefited personally from the parking operation. She said no. The accountant's report was placed in front of her, highlighting reimbursements tied directly to revenue spikes. Lauren's attorney objected. Overruled. Her voice faltered when she tried to explain it away. By the time questioning ended, the image she had carefully built collapsed under its own weight. Not because she was shouted down, but because she could no longer keep the story straight. The judge recessed briefly. When he returned, he didn't waste words. He rejected the abandoned land claim outright, stating that absence does not nullify ownership and that due process is not optional. He cited the lack of notice, the fabricated permits, and the unauthorized commercial use of private property. He stated plainly that the HOA's actions met the legal threshold for fraud and unjust enrichment. The parking operation was declared illegal, effective immediately. The ruling came without hesitation. The HOA was ordered to cease all activity on the land, dismantle the parking infrastructure, repay all profits derived from the operation, and cover damages and legal costs. The judge added that further review of board conduct would be referred to appropriate authorities. Lauren stared straight ahead, unmoving. I didn't feel relief right away. What I felt was stillness, a strange quiet after months of pressure, noise, and distortion. The truth hadn't needed force. It had only needed a room where facts mattered more than confidence. As we left the courtroom, my attorney shook my hand once and said, "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." Outside, sunlight hit differently. The land was still mine. It always had been. But now, finally, no one could pretend otherwise. The courtroom felt deliberately neutral, as if it had been designed to strip emotion out of everything that entered it. Pale walls, hard benches, a judge who didn't look impressed by confidence or intimidated by paperwork. Lauren Whitmore sat across the aisle from me, flanked by attorneys who whispered to her in tight, urgent bursts. For the first time since I returned home, she didn't look in control. She looked cautious. When the hearing began, there were no dramatic speeches, no grandstanding, just facts, presented one after another, like weights being placed carefully on a scale. My attorney started with the simplest truth: ownership. The deed was entered into evidence, clean and uncontested, recorded years before the parking lot ever existed. Tax records followed, showing uninterrupted payment for more than a decade, year after year. No gaps, no delinquency, no abandonment. The judge reviewed them slowly, then asked the HOA's counsel a single question about whether ownership itself was being disputed. They said no. That alone shifted the room. Next came the permits. Lauren's attorneys tried to argue that board authority allowed for temporary use of unused land in the interest of the community. My attorney asked for the permits cited in the HOA's own documents. The numbers were read aloud. Then a county official testified under oath. Her voice was steady as she explained that those permits did not exist, that the numbering format was invalid, and that no approvals had ever been issued for construction, electrical installation, or commercial parking on that parcel. The judge's pen stopped moving. Utility records followed. Evidence showed power drawn through an account that did not legally correspond to the property, installed without inspection or compliance. The word unauthorized was used more than once. The judge looked directly at Lauren when he asked who approved the installation. No clear answer came. Then the financial records were introduced, and the tone of the room changed completely. The forensic accountant didn't accuse, he explained. He walked the court through monthly income statements, fee schedules, and internal transfers. The parking lot wasn't offsetting HOA costs. It was generating consistent profit, thousands of dollars every month. Fees had been raised not due to expenses but demand. Late penalties and premium spots had been added strategically. This wasn't negligence, it was design. The accountant then showed how that revenue moved. Vendor payments that traced back to board members. Reimbursements timed precisely with income spikes. Temporary. Expenses that never ended. The pattern was unmistakable. When Lauren was called to testify, she stood with the same practiced posture I'd seen in HOA meetings, but it didn't last. Under direct examination, she repeated familiar language, community benefit, safety concerns, board discretion. Under cross-examination, the language collapsed. She was asked why no certified notices were sent to the landowner. She claimed the board believed I was unreachable. My attorney introduced evidence showing the HOA had asked county officials about notice requirements and been told exactly what was required. Lauren hesitated, then said she must have misunderstood. She was asked how land could be labeled abandoned when taxes were paid continuously. She said abandonment was determined by use, not payment. The judge interrupted and asked where that standard appeared in law. She couldn't answer. Then came the signatures, documents bearing the same board member's name but clearly different handwriting. Lauren said she didn't oversee signatures. She was asked why her own signature appeared identical on every document. She said she signed electronically. Records showed they were filed as handwritten. Her attorney objected. Overruled. The final question broke what remained of her composure. She was asked whether any board member had benefited personally from the parking operation. She said no. The accountant's report was placed in front of her, highlighting reimbursements and related party payments. Lauren stared at the page longer than necessary before saying she didn't recall authorizing those transactions. The judge leaned forward. When testimony ended, the court recessed briefly. The silence during that break felt heavier than the arguments. When the judge returned, he didn't delay. He rejected the abandoned land claim entirely, stating clearly that absence does not erase ownership and that due process is mandatory, not optional. He cited the lack of notice, the fabricated permits, the unauthorized utilities, and the monetization of private property. He stated that the HOA's conduct constituted fraud and unjust enrichment. The parking operation was declared illegal, effective immediately. The ruling was issued from the bench. All parking activity was ordered to cease. The HOA was ordered to dismantle the lot, repay all profits derived from it, and cover damages and legal costs. The judge added that board conduct would be referred for further review. Lauren didn't react. She didn't argue. She didn't look at me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. The kind of calm that comes not from winning, but from having reality restored. As we left the courtroom, I understood something clearly. Authority only works as long as no one forces it to explain itself. The moment facts are required, power without truth collapses on its own. I didn't go back to the land right away. When the noise finally stopped, no emails, no letters, no warnings taped to fences, I needed a moment to let it settle. Winning didn't feel like triumph. It felt like quiet. The kind that comes after you've held your breath for too long. When I did return, the gates were gone. The signs were gone. Tire marks faded into bare ground where asphalt would soon be torn up. I stood there alone, on soil that had never stopped being mine, and understood something I hadn't before. Anger would have cost me everything. Patience gave me back what mattered. I had wanted to fight them from the start, to shout, to force the truth out into the open. But authority feeds on reaction. It grows stronger when challenged emotionally. What breaks it is evidence, time, and the willingness to let it expose itself. They had power. They had confidence. They had a system designed to scare people into silence. What they didn't have was ownership, and in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. I looked around and imagined what was supposed to be here all along. The workshop. Open doors. My sons learning, building, laughing. A future that had been delayed, not destroyed. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Authority without truth always collapses when it's forced to explain itself. You don't have to be louder. You just have to be right and patient enough to prove it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to HOA and Karin Stories and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today?